This is going to be our last one on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. We're going to migrate over to the Friendly Grow Hub. So we'll still be having this. Uh, Peter, we'll still be going along, won't we? Still be
Yep.
answering the
Still
questions,
be
but
here.
it's just going to be a bit simpler and easier on Grow Hub. So this is a really good opportunity for everybody out there. If you've got some burning compost questions and you just haven't plucked up the courage yet, now's a really good time to ask us any question you've got, and we will answer them the best that we can. We have a bunch of questions from last week and some really exciting one to kick it off. And Peter, I know you're an expert with biochar. What is your... Well, let's get into it. Let's talk a little
Okay.
bit about
We'll jump right into it. So the question that Linda had was, she just made some biochar and she's ready to use it in her sub pod. I was really happy to see that. And what it basically is if you take charcoal and you grind it up finely and you put it into the soil, people basically call that biochar because it starts to get colonized by microbes. It'll start binding nutrients, and it basically becomes this amazing source of goodness for your garden soil. It doesn't break down quickly the way other carbon does, and so think of it as like a long term, maybe up to 1,000 years before the really hard forms of biochar break down. So it's a long-term sort of time delay energy source for feeding nutrients back into your soil. It was discovered by the Mesoamericans when they
I was
had
just about to ask you
rainforests.
about the story. Yeah, if you could
Yeah,
tell us the story.
yeah. So a quick thing about the story was there had been all this speculation that people had seen, vast inland empires in the Amazon, and then later they checked out the soil and they said it couldn't possibly support, a lot of people because it's an energy poor soil. And then people were flying over the rainforest, and then there's these patterns of growth that were geometric, so circles and lines of extra verdant growth you could see from a plane. And when they went down to the ground, they realized this was man-made, highly fertile soil. And when they tried to reverse engineer it, they realized it was mostly due to biochar. So it got excited everyone to think about how they could improve soils, especially in high rainfall areas, to hold nutrients better and improve productivity.
Check out this photo. Is this what you're talking about?
That's exactly it. So terra preta is the Brazilian name for it, and basically that's the difference. Is there's even a rumor that it self-generates. So basically, it's holding a tremendous amount of biological life, and it holds on to those small cations like carbon that have a hard time staying in the soil when you have a high rainfall. So anyway, back to subpod. What's interesting about putting it into your subpod system is I've noticed that it tends to produce a higher density of worms, and it makes sense because the microbes are colonizing all that tremendous surface area inside of the charcoal, and so there's basically a more complete food supply. But when your worms are done making the compost, you have an extra beneficial compost ready for the garden. So it includes both the biochar loaded up with microbes and nutrients, as well as your classic worm castings. So when I've actually made liquid compost teas, you'll find very fine particulates from the biochar that then can go into the soil and percolate down and feed your plants and keep them happy. Just the question that this person had was basically they've made it and they wanted to know if they can use it as a substitute for carbon. It's actually think of it as a separate additive. So when I suggest people add it to their sub pods for composting, just a small amount at a time, like even less than a handful, just a couple of large soup spoons would be about right. It's fairly potent stuff. It tends to have a high pH when it's just been freshly made. So you basically, by adding a little all at each addition over time, the final product of compost will have a higher proportion because, as I said, it doesn't break down so much. So over time, as the other carbon gets metabolized, you'll see the increase of biochar in your final product. So treat it as a thing in addition to the wood pulp and shavings and whatever dry carbon source you're using.
Fantastic. That's really good to hear. And
and I'll add one more thing. So we're always looking for ways to keep carbon out of the air long term, and this is one of the most elegant solutions because basically it's recalcitrant to breaking back down. And so what'll happen is it'll stay in the soil. It'll do benefits for your soil fertility, and it's staying out of the atmosphere for a long time. So by carefully biocharing up your woody waste and putting it back into the soil, you're doing even more for the planet beyond the home composting side of things. So that's my plug for biochar.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sure we could talk about it a lot more. You've got a lot to say on it.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of experiments at my place with it, and I get fruit trees that start bearing a year early, and plants are super healthy with it. It tends to smooth out extremes. So as our climate is getting more extreme with weather, by having biochar around your plants, you actually are improving their resilience in times of stress.
Yeah, right. We'll have to do a live just on that one day, I think.
Yep, yep, absolutely. Okay, I'll just move right along here. We have a coffee bean question. Yeah, I had the same thing. If you're a coffee, well, this is someone who's used the beans, but let's say you've roasted fresh beans and you haven't gotten to them, and we all know we like fresh roasted coffee. So the old stuff, they're asking, can they just grind it up and put it directly in without leaching out the coffee first? It's fine to do that. You'll just have a few more nutrients, a bit more caffeine, but it's not a problem. I've checked the pH on straight beans, and it's not going to be a problem if you add small amounts. So go ahead and just add those directly in to your sub pod as another food source for the worms.
Fantastic. And such a common one. Such a common one, coffee. It's great to know that you can use it in a compost system.
Yeah, and in all different forms. So the hulls as well, when roasters have a generated waste product, you can use that as your dry carbon source. And then the wet material from cafes is a very nitrogen-rich material. Pretty much you can treat it like food, just don't overdo it.
Called the shell, the chaff?
Yes.
That's pretty good. I've used that as a mulch before. It's kind of like a sawdust substitute. Very light and fluffy.
Yeah. It's a thin husk, or a thin bit of paper and parchment inside of the bean. Actually, it's inside of the husk. Technically speaking, it's another layer inside of the bean after you've removed the husk.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got some hemp stalks.
Yeah, so this is also from Linda. She's asking another question about hemp stalks. So if her hemp stalks are as crushed as these, looks like sugarcane mulch or stalks, it's fine. Basically, because the stalks are going to be fairly fibrous, they want to be well shredded. And it's just a matter of the material is fine for the sub pod, but it has to be small enough that it'll break down readily, and you end up with a lot of material that's sitting there not breaking down. So my advice is put in some and see how it's behaving as far as its speed of breakdown, and you'll know how much you can add in without sort of overwhelming your system. And having a bit of chicken manure with that is actually okay if it's aged a bit, as long as it's not super fresh, as long as it doesn't have a strong ammonia smell still present. It should dry a bit first. Here's some magpies in the background there, Peter.
Yeah, I got a couple of friendly family visits.
Nice. Okay, so yes, safely uses carbon source. So just to summarize, you'll find out if it's not finely shredded enough, and then you won't be able to use it as your sole carbon source, just a little bit of an addition to the other things you're adding. And then Eric Howell has a question about his worm tea. So he's made some worm tea, and he wants to know if he can use it as a replacement for the water, or with a special thing to add to the plants. And the beauty of the worm tea is you actually can't make it too strong really for the plants. If you're watering it in, you can actually, if you have just a few plants, you can just use it as a water source, as a liquid fertilizer, and you don't need water afterwards. You can also dilute it a little bit if it's fairly intense, and put it on the foliage of the plants so they can get a direct feeding.
I was actually thinking this morning that would probably be another good topic to do a live on, because we've had a lot of questions upon how to make it, and there's so many different ways to do it. And one thing that I've seen people make mistakes with is they add too much molasses or too much food. And I know, Peter, that you're not really one to add molasses.
Yeah. So here's my thinking. I'll just go through it quickly.
Yeah.
Is is basically we know that the diversity of microbes in the worm castings is quite high already. And so if you just do a simple extraction where you take your castings and you put it in a paint strainer bag and give it a few massages in a bucket of water, it'll turn a deep brown color as you're extracting quite a bit of material off of the castings. And then just use that straight because you're preserving all the original biodiversity of those microbes. Once you start feeding them and bubbling it, you'll favor microbes that respond better under the conditions of giving them a simple sugar source. And those microbes that are growing up, that are amplified from a treatment, may or may not be the best microbes for your plant. So you think about it in terms of your own body, where you'll change the gut biota if you start eating a lot of sugar. Do you really want to produce a population that's tilted toward cells that divide rapidly because they can use a simple sugar source? I would predict that because that sugar source won't be present in your soil, you'll end up amplifying up that population of microbes that end up as basically starving and carcasses in the soil, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I'm a big proponent of diversity, of resilience and diversity. So if you extract the castings and then use that directly, you're preserving 100% of the diversity. So whatever cells are most responsive to the local conditions will then amplify and support the plant life. That's and also it's simple. You know, it's the sort of thing where I get it when you have a conventional heap composting and some of the other hot composting methods where you don't have the same diversity of microbes that you do with worm casting compost, and it makes sense to amplify up the biological life in the liquid, especially if you're diluting it and spraying it over a large region, and especially if you're using it in areas that have been impoverished of microbial life. But if you're putting it in your raised bed and you've started with good soil and there's carbon in there, it's not going to be impoverished from biological life, especially if you're staying with organic fertilizers. So in that condition, I would say it's perfectly fine. Do a simple extraction, water your plants with it, do a bit of foliar feeding. And I can show you later in my garden, I did an experiment where I was doing a once a week foliar feeding of my plants, and they did spectacularly with that. So
that's great. I think as humans, we often like to complicate things. So yeah, no, that's really, thanks for sharing very, very succinctly about that. And
sure.
You're seeing results as well. So
yeah, that's the thing, is there's theory and then there's results. And so I've read a lot of the material where people have kind of restored tired soils with some of the bubbling and sugar methods, where some microbes are better than no microbes, but you tend not to see in careful studies that I've seen a big difference between that approach and using regular compost. So it's more of a solution you'd think about when you're trying to cover a large area with a small amount of compost and stretching it further. But I think most of us just have a little garden, and that's not really our concern.
Yeah, definitely. That's really good.
But
really
this is controversial. So this is just my perspective, and there's other opinions. And of course, I'm always welcome to be convinced by solid data. So my opinions always rest on empiricism and solid data.
That's great. And as you said, it's the application as well. For a little home gardener, it's simpler and you're getting good results. So.
You'll get good results. Just something as simple as a handful of your castings in a paint strainer bag, then return the castings and worms back to the sub pot afterwards.
And how long are you dunking it in your bucket of water for?
Oh, you don't have to spend a great deal of time. So for example, if you put more castings in that bag and you don't get a full extraction, that's perfectly fine. It's just more ready for the next time you do the extraction. So if you take 3 or 4 big handfuls into a larger paint strainer bag and then just do a simple 1-minute extraction, that liquid will turn a very deep brown color, and you're good to go to use that right away. And then whatever microbes are more firmly anchored onto the castings, well, eventually they'll find their way into the garden when you harvest your castings and apply them to your plants as well. So
yeah, that's true. Oh, cool. Well, I hope people got a good insight into worm tea. We'll definitely have to explore that more. It's a really cool topic.
Okay, next question I can see from Kathy is, she's got the tiniest white bugs in her compost. I think she was saying they're what the size of sawdust or thereabouts. Probably you don't need to be concerned about them. Sometimes if you have a wood source, they could be something feeding off the wood, but for the most part, if they're white and they're tiny, if you send me a picture, I'd be happy to look it over in more detail. And I know you said that it was raining and you couldn't get a good picture, but feel free to send another picture, and I'd be happy to look. Especially you can get a nice close up. I'll have a look and see. But if they're larvae, they're typically going to be fruit fly. If they're tiny beetles or beetle larvae, it's probably not a concern. And I think you decided they weren't springtails, which is one of the most common white bugs. So in general, I think it's probably, especially if they're lingering on the surface, they're not going to be bothering the worms for the most part underneath. And then my advice to people always is, if you bury your fresh food waste under the surface of the bedding, you tend to minimize insect colonization events at the surface, because you're not leaving a lot of food up there at the surface layer in the air. Okay, next question is about adding shredded paper. Now, was there more context for this? They're wanting to know about inks. And do you remember, Peter, if there was?
No, it was just, can I add shredded office paper? Yes or
Absolutely,
no?
Absolutely. Yep, it's a good use of that paper material, because it's a dry carbon source. I wouldn't use that as my only source of carbon, but it's perfectly fine to shred it and mix it in. And especially the black and white inks tend to be, or black inks tend to be soy based, and so they should be a fine choice.
Is that everywhere? Like, I know in Australia we have soy-based inks for our newspapers. What about in the States?
I think it's probably the same. I think generally the advice that I've come across is that you just want to avoid some of the glossy paper that has maybe some more intense colored inks that possibly could be a problem. But small amounts, even that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. And newspaper is fine. So, yeah, I think it's not really going to be a problem.
And if it's glossy, it's because it's got plastic on it. Is that the main?
Yeah, that's the idea. They've added some sort of plasticizers, maybe, and so there could be some microplastic activity happening over time. That's a possibility.
Yeah, right. And we just want to minimize that. I am
Yeah.
curious to know, like, if you put, because every now and then, for me at least, a bit of colored cardboard will end up in the sub pod. I'm trying to be pedantic as I can. The microplastic in there slowly would break down. Would that get absorbed into the soil and into the plants? Like, what is the relationship there?
Yeah, so I've seen a few studies about what happens to microplastics in the soil, and it seems like, so far from what people have done, they've done studies where they've deliberately added in microplastics and then studied the biological life in the soil afterwards and how it's changed. And it seems like the intermediate scavengers are the ones most affected. So the bacteria don't seem to be so affected, at least under the duration of that study. But it's the small arthropods that tend to be most, they deplete the population numbers, which I guess could be akin to what happens in the oceans when you have marine creatures swallowing plastic. It starts to interfere with their digestion. Could imagine it could be a similar story with the small insect life in the soil.
Yeah, interesting.
So generally, keeping it out is the best. Just takes a very long time to break down, and we all know there's plastics we want to keep out of our bodies. So where we can, just the whole thing about the tea bags and all of that. Some of them, the special mesh tea bags tend to have microplastics, so avoid those in your compost.
Yeah. Blew my mind when I found that tea bags had microplastics in there. I was like, what? You're putting it in hot water. Like, why?
Yeah. I know. It's one of these things where we're always learning. We always have to be on top of this stuff.
I know, right? Can't trust anyone.
Okay, next question we have is, how do you harvest from the mini? Okay, I put together what I hope is a very clear article on this. And basically, the mini is a bit different than the classic because you don't have a divider. And so when you harvest, you're harvesting everything all at once. And so I've offered some suggestions for how people can do that. One of the ways is you have a couple of bins. I'll just describe it briefly, but if you look on Grow Hub, I'm going to upload the article today because people looked it over and given their green light. And the idea is you're using the light avoidance that worms have. And so you either do it on a sunny day or under a bright light, and you spread out a layer of the castings into a couple of shallow bins, and then you carefully scrape the top layer. And then you, if you encounter any food, you put that into a separate bucket. A few stray worms, you put it in the same bucket with the food, and then those castings you're scraping go into your casting bucket. And you'll find that if you have two bins like this, and you go back and forth between the two bins, by the time you scrape the top layer on one and start working on the next one, the worms have worked their way down deeper in the first one. You can scrape that next layer. And eventually the worms are traveling to the very bottom of your bin, and you can just return them right to the sub pod. So that's the easy way of doing it. And then one last tidbit is if you don't add the fresh food waste. If you're thinking you're going to be doing this in the next week, then you can avoid having to sort through really fresh food waste as you're sorting castings. And that's just a bit nicer experience. But it shouldn't take more than, especially if you only did half of it, it would take a bit over an hour and a half to do the whole thing. And you only have to do this every 6 months or so, and then you get a good load of castings. Okay. Next question I can see is from Mark, and asking about spiders and fruit flies. Fruit flies they're more of an annoyance and benign. Spiders, you want to make sure you don't have a venomous spider like in Australia, a funnel web that's colonizing your system. For the most part, fruit flies are taken care of by, like I said before, burying your food waste under the surface of the bedding, and then you're not providing a surface where yeast forms, which then attracts the fruit flies. So what you can do is, after you've aerated your food waste, you can just tuck you don't have to get zealous about this, just tuck the extra pieces of food, especially the fruit, under the surface. And, if there's a few bits lying around, it's not a big deal, especially vegetables won't do it. But especially it's the fruit pieces that will tend to bring the fruit flies, as you might expect.
That's really good advice. And I think with fruit flies, like their life cycle is so short anyway. Like once you bury it under there or just put some more carbon in there, they end up just flying away. You can kill that cycle very easily, right? You can stop it. It's quite simple.
And they're fairly benign, and they're tiny and they don't bite you or anything. So it's easily managed. And also you can have a bit of care when you have your kitchen caddy. You don't leave the top off the kitchen caddy. If a fruit fly gets into your house and lays eggs in there, that can start little larvae going, which are annoying, but again, not problematic. So as long as you leave the caddy lid on between adding food scraps, you don't tend to get them coming into the kitchen caddy.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the spiders, I do remember one story. Haven't really had many people talk about spiders, but somebody did have a red back, and they just got the hose and just hosed it out, and that was enough to get the spider going. Because my understanding, spiders really like moist and wet conditions, and that will just encourage them to leave. So, yeah,
that's a good idea.
Simple way.
Yeah. If you just give them a bit of a spray, and then they leave. Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. So the next question we have is from Maureen, and she's using the TARP method for harvesting, and she's asking what happens when I add worms back to my bed if she doesn't have a sub pod.
What is the TARP method, Peter?
Well, it's probably going to be the same thing I'm talking about, where you spread out the worms in a thin layer, they crawl down low, and you scrape off the top to harvest. So the one thing I want to be clear about is she collecting from another system for her compost worms? Because I would generally take all my compost worms and put them back into my whatever system I have. And so if there's a few stray worms, that end up in the bed. If you have mulch on top of the bed, they will survive in there because they tend to like to be in the leaf litter layer in the forest, just under the leaves and above the soil surface. But for the most part, you want to recollect your worms and put them back in your compost system.
Yeah.
So,
No,
but yeah, they're not adapted to be in straight soil the way classic earthworms are, and so they would tend to have a hard time making it unless you provided special conditions for them.
they're a sacrifice, and their bodies will decay into nutrients for your plants, but you don't really want to be doing that too much unless you got a serious population in your sub pod. You don't mind, but yeah.
Yeah, and you know, the perfect is the enemy of the good, as they say. So you try to keep most of your worms back and you put them back, but if lose a few get in there, it's just how it is. Okay, next question is about sourdough starter. Yes, it's totally fine. This will be a rich food source for the sub pod, and so what you'll tend to find is mold grows quite readily on wet yeast and wheat-based products. I'm not sure if this is a wheat sourdough starter or a rye, but if you spread it out, dilute it a bit, you won't have a thick region of the sourdough starter that would tend to mold up on you. So the easiest thing is if you maybe dilute it a bit, make it a bit more as a bit of a slurry, and then stir that through the bedding. You're less likely to develop mold. But even if you get a bit of mold, you just basically next time aerate that back in, break up the spores, and it's fine too.
And by diluting it, just putting some water in there, maybe shaking it up and adding it to the sub pod.
Yeah, you don't have to turn it into liquid soup, but just enough so it's not a thick, clumpy material that stays in one lump and then has a hard time kind of breaking down. Because you're trying to avoid anaerobic conditions where you don't want to have solid, dense foods that are sitting there that don't have oxygen getting to the middle for the aerobic bacteria to break them down.
That's a great tip.
Okay. Next we have Bonnie. She's saying her worms survived in the winter in the garage. That's great. Do you have her?
Yep, I've got a photo here, and there was more to this question that I couldn't fit in, but
Okay.
What Bonnie was asking was that because there's still eggshells in this compost, does that mean it's finished?
The eggshells will stay there. They'll tend to resist breakdown. So it's okay to put them in your garden soil. It's not a problem at all. And
It's great though, doesn't it?
It does. It looks from this image, it looks totally ready to go. So what you could consider doing, Bonnie, is since you're starting up your system in nicer weather, is get some fresh bedding for the sub pod, and then separate your worms from that finished compost, and then go ahead and use that finished compost in the garden for your spring planting.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a great question to end this little live. It's a kind of a celebration, because that's one of the big reasons why we're doing this. Of course, there's a lot of reasons why we compost, but getting that black gold at the end, and just to show you again, it's just, you can't buy this stuff. You really can't at the supermarket or the hardware store or the nursery.
It's true. Living foods, it's just the best way to go, just for our bodies and for our plants, for the soil. Yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk about some studies at some point of like using living soils like this, how that translates into our health, like those microbes going from our plants and then to our gut and the relationship between it. Because
it's an evolving field, so it's a fairly young field at this point. So the big discoveries of the complexity of the gut biota are relatively recent. And so the technology allows you to do a lot of parallel sequencing, so you can actually identify the complexity of the population. But the next big step is the function of all those microbes and how they interact. And so we have just the very skeleton understanding of some difficult players that you want to not have so much in your gut. But there's some basic principles about more diversity is better, because you look at hunter-gatherers in the forest, they had a huge diversity of foods that they were gathering, and that translated to a very diverse gut biota. and they tend to have more resilience. The more types of microbes you have, the more they can redevelop a balance. It's sort of a basic principle of biology. You have an ecosystem that has a lot of animals and plants adapted there. Then there's a resilience and a responsiveness to changing conditions, and the same would be true with the microbes in our gut. We just find it with modern life, as we've reduced food diversity, we tend to correspondingly reduce our gut diversity or gut biodiversity.
Right, and when we're looking at like a traditional agriculture system, there's not much life in those soils, and I suppose one part of it is the diversity of foods, but does the diversity of microbiota?
Yeah, it's there's two parts to that. So it's true. There's if you're eating directly from a garden that's had organic kind of principles where you have a rich soil bacteria, and some of those bacteria find their way into your gut, some of them will colonize back into your system, and that's a good thing. And then some of the foods will be prebiotic foods that are actually good food sources to favor microbes that you do want to have more of in your system. And so there's certain kinds of starches, resistant starches, that are very good prebiotic foods, for your friendly bacteria in your gut. That's another big subject. And
The potato, we'll have to do a live on the potato diet one
the
day.
potato hack, yeah, that's a good one. Or the winter I spent digging up my dandelion roots because the inulin is a starch that's stored in the roots of dandelions, which is very good as a prebiotic.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So down in Tasmania, if you've got what are considered dandelion weeds, let them grow really fat and vigorous through the winter. They'll tend to respond to winter conditions by storing more inulin, which is a nice prebiotic, and then you can just harvest them and eat them directly if you're hardcore, or
what's the other way?
Powder. You could they're not as bitter as the greens, actually, surprisingly.
Okay.
But yeah,
and the boiling up into tea, that would kill the.
Yeah, I would recommend is you could dry them a little bit and grind it up and then just stir it into foods.
Yeah, cool.
That's another way to go.
I'll definitely do that. I mean, it's a weed, it's free.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing about wildcrafting apparent weeds. Some of them actually have a bit more vitality, and so it's worth incorporating some of those into our diet.
We mean to read that book, The Rambunctious Gardener. Have you heard of it?
Well, I just remember from my permaculture, lessons or the teachers out there who, challenge us to rethink our paradigms around what's a plant and what's a weed, and to broaden our thinking about the function of plants and so.
That's such a good point, because weed is just really something that's.
It's a placeholder that we find annoying, and so we follow the weed.
It's bizarre. Cool. Well, I think that pretty much wraps us up, unless you had anything else to say, Peter.
No, I think that's good. If any questions popped in, we could answer those, but I think otherwise. Yeah, sorry to the guys out there who thought we were going to be doing this at 11 o'clock on Eastern Standard Time in Australia. So we're getting used to this different time zone to make sure we can have people on the west coast of the U.S. see it as well.
That was my mix-up, and we just had a daylight savings. So next week we will find a time that's more suitable. We'll probably throw it up on the Grow Hub so people can throw in their 2 cents for a time that kind of fits everyone, if that's even possible. But we'll throw this up on the Grow Hub and our other channels, just as a bit of a review and a watch for people out there, and people feel free to ask questions if anything else does come up. So yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in today. Really appreciate it. And happy
gardening. Happy composting.